Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to get everyone signed in and we'll go ahead and get started. This is Dina Jensen from the Center for Nonprofit Leadership at California Lutheran University, and we're delighted to have you. We have a little over 300 of our colleagues joining us this afternoon. We're going to probably anticipate a little bit of drift, but welcome everyone. We're going to let everyone get signed on. While you're getting signed on, just go ahead and make sure that you've got a Q&A feature open up on your Zoom. That's going to be how we track and monitor questions and answers to our subject matter experts today. While everyone's getting settled, I'll just express a deep sense of gratitude to my colleagues from Envision Consulting for being such terrific partners before, during, and after COVID-19. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today and presenting this really important topic.
Thanks for having us, Dina. It's always a pleasure working with the Center for Nonprofit Leadership.
I'm just going to give this another minute and we'll get started. Just a quick reminder that we are going to be recording today's session, and that once Zoom processes the file, we'll be sending that out to our registrants. That way, if anything does come up and you're not able to be with us the full time, you'll have the webinar recording. And ladies, when we get a little over half, I'll go ahead and get us started.
Great.
A question is, will you also be sending the slides as well? Can maybe send the slides in the post as well?
Absolutely.
Yes. Terrific, yes. Just going to give that one more minute and we're going to go ahead and get going. Again, inviting you to have the Q&A box open for questions and answers of our panelists. We'll take a couple of little stops throughout the presentation for your questions and answers. Both Suzanne and Jen have reviewed all the questions that were supplied in advance and to the extent possible tried to weave them into their remarks. We've got a pretty big topic today, so not everything is going to get the attention it needs and deserves, but we're going to do our best. Ladies, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon. This is Dina Jensen, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership at California Lutheran University, and it is truly my honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. This one was very much in demand from previous webinar participants asking the question about what about board governance in this unprecedented times. Now, if each of us had a nickel for every time that we've used the word unprecedented in the last 6 weeks, we would likely not need our next session, which is going to be on May 12th on fundraising in unprecedented times. So much like we did in the economic crisis and during the recession, everything was weathering the storm. This is weathering the unprecedented. So I hope everyone is taking care of themselves and taking care of each other. Just a couple of notes. We have over 300 people enrolled in today's session. So for the sake of managing everyone, we're going to invite you to use the question and answer feature to pose questions to our presenters. We're also going to ask that if you have any technical issues with Zoom, not questions and answers, but technical issues, that you use the chat box on the right-hand side of Zoom. This session will be recorded and the slides and the recording will be shared after today's session. I know we're all nonprofit leaders here, board members, executive directors, program staff, and all of us know how much it takes to put something like this on. So I'd like to also express our appreciation for our convening partners, the Ventura County Community Foundation, the Santa Barbara Foundation, the Fund for Santa Barbara, the Nonprofit Resource Network in Santa Barbara, and also Envision Consulting that has been a real treasured partner. I'll also extend a debt of gratitude to the Center for Nonprofit Leadership Advisory Board and the leadership at Cal Lutheran, who recently gave approval to keep all of our webinar content free of charge through the end of May. And so as with all of our work, it takes a lot of generous people to underwrite sessions like these. For that, we're very, very grateful. Just another quick reminder, we're going to be sending this all out. I covered all of that. Let me just introduce two very dear friends, Suzanne Elliott and Jen Lobenhofer, who are with Envision Consulting. Had a deep conversation about what's happening in boards of directors. You all supplied a number of questions to help inform today's session. We're going to be on this webinar for about 90 minutes, and we're going to leave enough time for questions and answers that might crop up. But we're also going to be tackling a really expansive topic here, and we're not going to be able to get to everything. And so I'd like right out the gate to just say that we're not going to get into detailed advice and technical assistance around federal relief packages. We're going to encourage you to check out the resources and weekly webinars from the Economic Development Collaborative. I'll go ahead and put a link to their COVID-19 resource page in the chat box in just a moment, and encourage you to hop on those calls if you're looking for technical assistance around the loan programs. But what we are going to talk to you all with each other today is the important role of board governance during COVID-19. And as with everything, the fragility and the strength of our boards of directors are brought into very sharp focus in times like these. But there's also an incredible opportunity to amplify the leadership that is in the boardroom. And so we're going to go through a series of slides with Jen and Suzanne, really talking from their perspective as a regional consulting practice, and now a national consulting practice. The things that they're seeing in the boardroom, where they're seeing successes, and also where they're seeing organizations perhaps sitting in a state of paralysis a little bit, and how do we get through that paralysis? I really thank everyone for their incredible leadership during this time. And ladies, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dina. Jennifer and I are really thrilled to be presenting this webinar today. We always do a lot of work with boards of directors, but the past 6 or 7 weeks, we have been facilitating many more board meetings, both planned and emergency board meetings, and fully recognize the incredible importance of the nonprofit board right now. Just to give you a quick idea of, for those of you who don't know Envision, don't know Jennifer and I, who we are a consulting firm that exclusively works with nonprofit organizations. Our services are executive search, organizational strategy, and leadership development. There are 10 of us on the team, and we have offices in Los Angeles and also in New York. And our clients are really all over Southern California, New York, New Jersey, and other cities as well. We do, though, have a particularly affinity for the Ventura County, Santa Barbara County area. Jennifer lives in Thousand Oaks, and I lived in Thousand Oaks until recently. So know many of you personally, and very happy to have you here with us today. But the content we're presenting really is relevant to all nonprofits. So for those of you who are, in other parts of the country, this is going to be completely relevant to you as well. And as Dina said, we've tried to weave in the questions that you shared with us through the survey that we sent out with registration. We're also going to pause after each section for some Q&A and save time at the end too. So before we dive into the content, we're going to pull up a poll as I start talking here, just to do a temperature check of where we all are right now. So this is like kind of the basic, how do you think your board is functioning at this point in time? And it's an anonymous poll, so please be honest. Do you feel like just we're a mess, we're all over the place? Or, we're nervous, but we're kind of figuring it out. Or are you functioning better than ever? Or maybe that kind of all of the above, which I would say all of the above, maybe / it depends on the day, which is also a very real answer. So go ahead and just give us a quick temperature check of where you are. And once we get some poll responses there, I'll just share what everyone says. But just to tee this up, I mean, as Dina said, it goes without saying, the past 6-7 weeks for all of us have been truly unprecedented and extraordinary. And, we feel that, nowhere maybe has that been felt more than in the nonprofit sector. So, as nonprofit organizations, you have these intersecting roles with direct service for very vulnerable populations. Many of you who have staff, you're employers. You're also businesses that need revenue to function. That's a very real part of the nonprofit world. And also, organizations are people, at the core. And as human beings, the fragility and vulnerability that we're all feeling, it's part of our organizational picture as well right now. So, we recognize that and have woven that into what we're saying today as well. Rosie, can we share where we are with the poll? Okay, so at 70% of us are saying we're nervous, but we're figuring it out. That's great. And that's, I think, very real for all of us, in our own personal lives, as well as work and everything else, very natural to feel nervous about the situation now and in the future, but great to hear that you feel like your boards are starting to maybe figure things out, see some light. That's great. So, we do have tremendous respect for the work being done by board and staff right now. For boards and as well as for staff, you feel the real weight of leadership, during these times of crisis. And you also are juggling, for board members, your own work, outside of your volunteer work on the board. You're juggling your own families and personal challenges. And that's heavy for all of us right now. And we think it's really important to acknowledge that we're all doing the best that we can in really extraordinary circumstances. So just to give you another sense of who we have on the call today, we're almost half and half in terms of board and staff. We have about 45% board members and 55% staff on the phone today, which is fantastic. We were really excited to see that. Sometimes when we do these board governance trainings, it's mostly staff and not too many board members, but really great that we have board members on the line today. And while a lot of what we're talking about today is the role of boards, we're also going to be touching on how board and staff can support each other. And certainly we also know that, senior staff, you're playing a real role in liaising with your board during this time, all the time, but particularly now. So hopefully many or most of your organizations have been in more close communication in the past couple months because of everything going on. Many of you have probably already had some difficult conversations. If you haven't yet, you will be having some difficult conversations in the times ahead. And those conversations are going to be critical for many of your organizations to survive, and then certainly to sustain over the longer term. Now is not the time to be putting, head in the sand, or to try to proceed kind of status quo, or to make assumptions based on things that were true a few months ago. So what we're going to do today is break down considerations for this shorter time frame, kind of what's in front of us right now, and then also look to those strategic questions and considerations for the longer term for your organizations. So I've called this the shortish time because, let's be honest, this is it's very uncertain. I think actually right around now, I think Governor Newsom is giving a press conference talking about kind of maybe the next few weeks in California. We don't really know what he's going to say. There's just a lot of uncertainty, but we're defining right now this kind of short time frame as, as long as there are stay-at-home orders, offices are closed, your facilities are closed, schools are closed, this really atypical time frame, like that's how we're defining as the short term for right now and what boards need to be thinking about. So we have 4 kind of main priorities that we think boards need to be focused on right now, immediately, if you haven't done so already. Their first point is, board members, it's time to step up. Now more than ever is the time to be engaged and know what's going on with your organizations and support them. This is part of your role and responsibility as a board member. And really, if you've ever been in any of our board governance trainings before, you're familiar with Board Source and the 10 roles and responsibilities of a nonprofit board. Each of those is absolutely critical right now. So from oversight to planning to support, those are all critical during a crisis. But the caveat is, while kind of the overall role and responsibility for the board remains and is incredibly critical, individual roles might look a little bit different right now, depending on different board members' capacity and bandwidth right now. So it is important to understand for board members to be honest with each other about what they can and can't do, what their capacity is, and align those expectations and respond accordingly. So there's some board members who will have more time to give now. Using that time, using the talent, using the treasure of your board members and getting creative with it is really important. And leaning particularly into the talent side of the equation. We've really seen some phenomenal examples from some of our clients, ways that board members have either found connections they maybe didn't think about before, or have helped organizations with some of their knowledge that maybe wasn't as relevant 3 months ago and now is really important for the organizations. For example, a very tangible example is I've seen some boards where corporate executives who serve on nonprofit boards who have done a lot of Zoom and video conference meetings kind of in their work lives are now able to help to facilitate that technology side for the nonprofit boards that are maybe meeting by video for the first time. So that's just one example, but there are many. And on the flip side of the coin, there are some board members, possibly even some officers, who aren't going to be able to step up in the same way that they have in the past. Whether it's family obligations or some might have frontline responsibilities in their own work. Understanding that is really important. At the same time, it is not okay for board members to completely disengage or be completely not responsive. We had one example with a client where they have a board member who is a very senior level executive in a large corporation. And, he was honest and said, I'm not going to be as available every day or even on my committee right now, but I know my overall responsibility to this board. I will still be there for board meetings, including emergency board meetings. And when I'm there, you will have my full attention. I will prep for it, but I need to step back from my committee right now. That's a very honest and acceptable response. If you do have any board members, though, who are not responding at all to email, who haven't engaged at all during the past couple of months when we've been in this crisis time, then I would say it's time for the board chair to have one-on-one conversations with those board members to see if either, do they need to take a step back? If your bylaws allow a leave of absence, maybe they would need to take a leave of absence. Or either if you don't allow a leave of absence, or if they just really don't foresee a time in the future when they'll be able to re-engage, it might be time to step down from the board. Hopefully that's not the case with any of your board members, but what you don't want now is to have board members who aren't engaged at all, who are not fulfilling their responsibility. You're trying to move ahead and make critical decisions and are held back because you're not getting that engagement. So that is really important. Another kind of tactical idea that speaks to, where you are now and bandwidth of board members is, considering you have your standing committees, hopefully, that have been meeting and have been working together, there might be some smaller working groups that are really relevant now, whether it's an emergency response working group or specific topics that are really important for your organization. That's a great way to leverage time and talent of your board members and be really focused on the immediate topics that are facing you now. So then moving on, people first. We've got to, if you have staff in your organization, this is absolutely the time for the board to be supporting the staff, in particular the ED, pulling together as a network of people who really care about each other and care about a common mission. The chair of your board will serve a really important role now as that primary liaison to the executive director, both formally and informally. Many of the organizations we work with now, if the chair and the ED weren't speaking on like a weekly basis, basically, they are now, and I say really should be, because things are changing so quickly. It's really critical that the board chair knows what's going on with the organization, stays up to date, and then can be the bridge back to the full board. Another important piece here is EDs, regardless of the specific situation of your organization, are feeling even more stress right now. And to the extent that the board chair can help to minimize some of the burden of full board communication and can step up as that bridge back to the full board, it's going to be very helpful. And then for the full staff, I think, overall, one of the things that we've been saying is this is unfortunately a marathon crisis, not a sprint crisis. This is going to be with us in some way, shape, or form for a long time. And we need to help our staff members, have that endurance to keep going for the long term. And part of that is, some maybe letting go of some of the tasks, some of the priorities that were really important a few months ago, but maybe in this new reality can go by the wayside or can be deprioritized at least for some period of time. And the board will help, it plays a critical role in helping the ED to reprioritize activities for the staff to see what might be able to take a back seat for now. We've been helping some of our organizations that we did strategic planning with to look through the strategic plan and look at some of the areas that were high priority earlier and maybe now are need to be deprioritized temporarily. And then finally, with the staff overall, I've been encouraging boards to just look for big and small ways that you can just show support, whether it's the board coming together and sending food delivery gift cards to the staff. Or I had one board member who, is sewing. She sews, and so some of their staff actually still have to be out in the community, not in public, not in healthcare, but interacting with people. And she stepped up and had masks made for the staff. So there are lots of big and little ways that the board can show support for the staff, even if it's just like sending an email to say like, we've got your back. You guys are doing a great job. It's more important now than ever. And then our third point is around the finances, which are just as important as the people, really. Knowing where you are, your current financial picture is absolutely critical. And I would emphasize here cash management. If you aren't already doing a cash flow forecast, and hopefully many of you are, but if you aren't, now is definitely the time for your finance committee and ED to work together on a cash flow forecast. I would say at least for the next 3 months, ideally for the next 6 months, if you can, put that together to really understand then and be able to pressure test your revenue assumptions to see where there might be some gaps ahead. Certainly we know many organizations that have had to cancel or postpone fundraising events. And other funds that, public funding that, might be uncertain now. We need to think through that and think through different revenue and financial scenarios. So, ideally you'd be putting together 3 scenarios for the next few months, kind of the best case of, okay, if things really, everything we hope comes through does come through and expenses are where we think they're going to be. And then the worst case where, if really multiple revenue sources fall through, other expenses go up, what's that worst case? And then kind of the middle level that is, maybe what you feel most confident that's going to happen. That is ideally what you're doing. If you can't do a full kind of 3 scenario build out, at least kind of get a sense of best and worst case, just so that you have some visibility and you're looking at what your assumptions are. And ideally that is the finance committee working hand in hand with ED and senior staff. And then, communicating that back to the full board so the full board understands the financial picture and what some of the scenarios might be that you're facing and can help make decisions accordingly. And then going along with that, all of the different, relief grants and loans, at the federal, state, local level, these are moving so quickly there that certainly staying on top of all of that and applying for everything that you are eligible for and taking advantage of that funding that's available. And if you're on kind of in direct response, all of the direct response funds, that are now coming online is really important, but it is very overwhelming. And because the information is changing so quickly, this is an area where the board can be very helpful for the staff. Having maybe a small working group, monitoring different websites or different, federal versus state versus local, and helping the ED and senior staff staying updated on what's going on. And then even helping with, some of that information gathering, processing applications, and so on. Some of our clients who did receive PPP loans in the first round had board members who were very engaged in helping them to make sure their applications were ready as soon as they were being accepted, and had really stayed on the ball with that and stayed up to date. So financial piece is absolutely critical. And then finally, this is really a segue into our next section that Jen's going to take over. You got to understand where you are right now, what the immediate impacts are for your organization. And much of this, I think most organizations over the past, month or so have processed figuring out what their current situation is. But for some, it's shifting. It was one thing 6 weeks ago and it's kind of shifted to something else now. But, you've got to understand with the world kind of in its current pause situation, what is the immediate impact on your people, on your operations, on your programs, on your constituents? And our friend and fellow consultant, Julie LaCouture, has described it in one of our previous webinars as 3 different boats. We're all in kind of this big storm together, but nonprofit organizations kind of fall into one of 3 boats in terms of your situation. And before I turn it over to Jennifer to talk through those 3 different boats and considerations for what you're all facing immediately, Dina, I wanted to ask if do we have questions coming up that we should address before we move on?
Not at this point.
Okay, well, maybe I'll pause and say if anyone does have a question right now and you want to throw it into the Q&A box, we'll pause here for a moment before we move on.
And as we give folks a second to pose any questions, Suzanne, I'm just adding the rapid response funds at both the Santa Barbara Foundation and Ventura County Community Foundation into the chat box so everyone has those websites.
Excellent, thanks, Dina. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions coming up right now. So Jen, I'll pass the virtual baton over to you.
Across the country. Thank you, Suzanne. Did we actually just get a question?
Yes, so.
Shall we take a moment?
Yes, so I have a question from Jenny. Since normal financials aren't really possible since our programs are suspended, what kind of financials should we be doing?
So I think that gets into the scenarios, so looking at like what's your current balance sheet, and I see the follow-up, it should be running the 3 scenarios and memorializing them. Yes, so I mean, you take your current balance sheet, what are your assets and liabilities as of today? I mean, we all as organizations have those. And then look at some scenarios going forward. So, for your organization, if your programs are completely suspended, think about, okay, if they are suspended, until August and we can start them up again in August, what would that look like for us revenue wise? And then, expenses. If we, think through a couple of different scenarios that are relevant to your organization and just, build those out in terms of revenue and expenses and looking at where you are.
And Suzanne and Jen, I've got a question from Ruth. How do we plug into national information as a board member during this time?
So national resources, we have some on our website actually, and we can include them in the notes when we send out. National Council of Nonprofits, I think, has been doing a really good job. I actually think, you know, a lot of the local nonprofit support organizations, CNL, Nonprofit Resource Network in Santa Barbara, some of the Nonprofit New York in New York, and many others have been really staying on top of like being kind of that information clearinghouse. But there are some national, I mean, Board Source for board governance has been doing a pretty good job. Candid, if you're familiar with the Old Foundation Center and guys, they have been also consolidating funding opportunities. So there's a few national organizations that have some good resources to your question. So we'll include those in the notes.
I would also encourage folks to keep a sharp eye on Cal Nonprofits, our Association of Nonprofits in California. Has been doing a lot of really important policy advocacy work. I have a question here from Javier. Typically, this is a time we recruit new board members. Does not seem like the best time to do so. What experience do others have with this? I'm thinking of just asking board members whose term expire to continue for an extra year.
So we are working with some organizations that are extending terms for board members. That's absolutely something we're seeing. We also, though, are working with a number of organizations that are moving into board recruiting, you know, and are doing their best to continue recruiting in a, you know, in a virtual way. It's a different process. It looks a little bit differently. The caveat there is if you don't already have someone like in your pipeline, so like they're part of a committee, they're somehow connected to your organization, you know, there may be like a board prospect already. We think it's going to be pretty hard to just kind of go out and cold recruit new people into that pipeline right now. Probably not impossible. I'm sure, you know, it's possible, but much harder. So, but if you do already have some people who might be kind of warm prospects, you might be are sort of in your pipeline for board recruitment, you know, continuing on and in that recruiting process is something that we are seeing from a lot of organizations.
Suzanne, to bookend that question, we have a very brave poster by the name of Martin who says, I'm very interested in becoming a member of a board of directors.
Amazing.
I feel like that might be 185 people who would like to talk to Martin. So why don't we do this? So why don't I capture some information from Martin and we'll follow up offline about that. I have one other question. How hands-on is realistic for your board to be in initiating communication and helping with tasks around finances and research on resources?
And I'm actually hoping to answer that a little bit in the material I'm going to be covering coming up. And I think it's very much in line with what Suzanne said about, you know, offering compassion and understanding of where individual board members are. But the other side of that is many board members do want to help and aren't exactly sure how to do so, and that staff and executive directors in particular need to be very specific and clear in making their asks. And if you're asking them to communicate, give them a script with some talking points, or give them, you know, as much guidance and as much specificity as you possibly can. And, you know, understand that not everyone is in a place where they can be fully engaged or even more engaged than in the past right now, but paddle the boat with those that are in the boat and ready to pick up a paddle, to go with the boat metaphor that we're going to keep going here as well.
Okay, so why don't we move on to that?
All right, let's do that. So Suzanne referenced this helpful sort of framing device metaphor of which boat is your organization in right now. And we feel like it's really important, as Suzanne said, for you to understand where you are currently as a result of choices you made or choices that were forced on you when this all sort of began 6 weeks ago or so. Both to understand what, again, to extend the metaphor, what paddle you need to pick up right now and how fast to row with that paddle, and who else might need to be in the boat, or if it's time to take a step back, take stock, and decide to make a change in which boat you're in that you happen to jump into sometime in early to mid-March. So what we're talking about is three kinds of organizations, or three positions in which nonprofit organizations may find themselves right now. There are the emergency response organizations, and this is fairly obvious what we're talking about. We're talking about organizations that meet basic needs, whose demand for services has at least remained the same, or in many, many cases, of course, become even more urgent as we've felt the health and economic effects of the pandemic. We're talking, food banks and organizations engaged in homeless services, engaged in healthcare delivery, senior services. Those are, all of those organizations that are kind of in an all hands on deck crisis response mode. And the second set of organizations are, again, these may not be mutually exclusive for some of you as well. Organizations that have found a way to quickly pivot the way in which they deliver their services, or maybe they're not delivering all of their services, but they're focusing on a subset and delivering them in a different way through delivery when it didn't used to be home delivery, or through, of course, any kind of virtual platform or online delivery of services. We're talking about things like a number of organizations, of course, but after school programs that have taken content virtual, or some social service support organizations that may be doing delivery, as I said, instead of having people come to their place to collect the items that they need. And then there are organizations that are in a little bit of a paused, wait and see mode, maybe just not sure how appropriate it is for them to be out messaging and fundraising, arts organizations, culture organizations, some things like that, perhaps. So let's, again, as we did at the very beginning, let's stop and take a temperature check on which boat are you in? Are you mostly, and I would say we know which mostly defines you, acknowledging that there are some possible overlaps here, or maybe you're not totally sure, but what do you think from your understanding of what's going on with your organization, which boat best describes the position that you're in? Are you in emergency response, everybody's head down, making sure that we're continuing service delivery, maybe ramping up service delivery? Have we found a way to pivot? We have services, but we were doing them a little bit differently, or wait and see, we're kind of in a little bit of a pause. And Rosie, as those start to come in, if you want to. As I said, we want to help you understand where you are, because you may have made a choice several weeks ago that maybe it's time to rethink. There are some consistencies, certainly, as Suzanne discussed, of the things everybody needs to be thinking about, and through lines to that. But some of the considerations, some of the next steps, in particular for board engagement, are going to vary a little bit based on which boat you're in. So it looks like we again have a pretty clear majority, that more than half of you are in a pivot mode of some sort. So that's 55%. Then we have several kind of wait and see, about 28% of those, and 17% emergency response. I'm not all that surprised that we don't have a whole lot of emergency response folks on here, because those folks are incredibly busy with emergency response. So let's move on from there. Thanks, Rosie. So as I said, there are certainly some consistent through lines to the actions that we sort of are recommending as the best next steps, things to think about, things to put into action for all three kinds of organizations. And those are, Suzanne referenced earlier, leaning heavily into the talent part of the time, talent, and treasure equation of your board. But that might look a little different depending on which boat you're in right now. And I said already in response to the question earlier that as you're leaning into that talent, be really specific. Executive directors in particular, and board chairs, as they're seeking out assistance and support from other board members, be really specific and clear about what it is that you need, and the specific ways that board members can utilize their expertise and their background to plug in and provide support. And the other consistent thing I would say is just don't stop communicating. We were certainly heartened and gratified to see from our registration poll that most of the folks on the call today have had at least some kind of board meeting, in some cases committee meetings, maybe executive committee, that you haven't stopped meeting as a board, even if you are an organization that's in a little bit more of a wait and see mode, that the vast majority have had some kind of board meeting. And hopefully that carries across that board members and board chairs and executive directors in particular are communicating consistently with each other. Don't stop communicating, and that's with your board, and also don't stop communicating with other stakeholders, with donors, with volunteers. So let's talk a little bit about specific recommendations of things to think about, to consider for the organizations in these three boats, as we're calling them. So first, for the emergency response organizations. If you have, these are the organizations where staff is probably got more than they can possibly manage in terms of just the day-to-day delivery of services to your client, to your community. And so board can really help in terms of providing some support in finance, as Suzanne talked about earlier, with understanding the financial picture. Board can step in and help navigate and interpret some legal or human resource management issues from the employer side of the nonprofit business, and that part of the nonprofit organization identity. Board members can help to provide communication and marketing, perhaps technology support in hosting Zoom meetings or other kinds of technological support. Be sure that you're continuously communicating with your stakeholders, donors, volunteers, folks. And if there's a board member who can step in and take over social media or putting together a brief newsletter, email newsletter that updates folks, so much the better. Lots of photos, doesn't have to be a whole lot of lengthy verbiage, text. Just make sure that folks know what it is you're doing and understand the situation that you're working in. Try to find ways that your volunteers that you've had in the past, or even new volunteers, can engage, even if it is at-home opportunities. And this obviously applies to the pivoting organizations as well. Perhaps even during a stay-home order, people can't come to your facility as they might normally, but are there ways that they can stay engaged at home, whether through putting together kits of some sort. Amazon wish lists have become really, really popular for nonprofit organizations, but maybe there's a way to go beyond that so volunteers feel like they're engaging further, where they can order items or have them delivered to their home and put them together in a specific kit. I'm thinking of a friend with a nonprofit that does some after-school enrichment with at-risk youth, and they had an Amazon wish list, and people could put together science kits so that kids can do a little bit of a science lesson and lab at home. And this is something else that I think Suzanne referenced, the access to emergency response funding. Emergency response organizations obviously have the best and the greatest opportunity for receiving financial support from various COVID-19 response funds that are thankfully popping up, and also getting new dollars from foundations as they shift their giving or ramp up their giving in important ways. Hopefully you have some board members who have the bandwidth and can help support your development team in tracking and filtering and navigating some of those opportunities. Perhaps they can even help with completing some applications to take some of that pressure of those kinds of considerations and responsibilities off your staff who are fully engaged in service delivery. So let's talk about the pivoting organizations now. And again, these are the folks and this describes most of you, as we've discovered in the poll, you've in some way changed your service delivery model and methodology to respond to the environment we're living in at the moment, and maybe for some time to come. We're going to evolve, but we may need to keep delivering services in whatever the new way is. Again, find specific board members who have capacity, who have expertise that can help support or underwrite some of those new service delivery models. We have clients where it's not just that somebody's helping run the Zoom meeting because they have experience with remote meetings, but maybe they're letting the organization utilize their Zoom Pro account, the paid kind of account, or other kinds of technology subscription services. There, again, are there board members who can help market in new ways the kinds of changes and services that are happening with your organization. Again, find ways to keep volunteers engaged, especially if you have gone virtual. What is it that volunteers can be doing behind the scenes for you in that to respond to and plug into and engage with that new model? And to the extent that you possibly can and have any bandwidth, and again, a great place for board to engage is think critically about the pivots you have made and the extent to which it might need or you might want for it to become an ongoing integrated part of the way that you're going to do business. You know, it could be just a 3-question survey at the end of an online module that you've delivered some content, or you know, just kind of testing with the community that you serve, how they're liking, or how the pivot is working for them, and how it's utilizing your staff time, and what the sustainability might be of that pivot. And this is also a really good time to actively seek opportunities for partnership that would enable you to amplify your efforts and maybe to do certain aspects of your service delivery better than you could on your own, or add new elements to your work. Could be informal collaboration at this point, just born of necessity of the time, or if you want to seek a formal memorandum of understanding, that could be an opportunity as well. We have a client organization that we know that does healthcare and specifically dental care for underserved youth in the Los Angeles area. And when the schools closed, they had to think about how to be able to reach their target population. And what they ended up doing was putting together, and this is another volunteer thing, they put together dental kits that they were able to connect with a school district and have that school district where they work distribute those dental kits along with the lunches that the school lunches that were being distributed for pickup. So those kinds of collaborative opportunities exist and can help you perhaps make a pivot or enhance a pivot or amplify the impact of a pivoting service delivery that you might be engaging in. And finally, for the wait and see, we're not totally sure what we should be doing or if we should be doing anything right now. Can we go to the next slide, Rosie? So, even if the major part of your programs or services are closed, we strongly encourage you to shift from the wait part of the wait and see to the see part of the wait and see, and think about how you might start to pick up where you left off when restrictions begin to ease and things begin to evolve back into some semblance of normal. Is that even really going to be an option for you after such a pause? Think about the multiple scenarios that Suzanne mentioned earlier. What's the best case of, yeah, we'll be able to just pick right back up as though nothing's changed. We just hit the pause button for a few months? What's the middle case? What's the worst case scenario in terms of thinking about how do we get back to where we were, or can we get back to where we were? Think at this point, now that we're several weeks in, about whether you can become a pivoting organization instead. Is there a way that you can offer your go ahead and begin to offer your services again in a different way, a virtual way, or whatever that pivot might look like? Or are there ways that you can partner with or provide support to either an emergency response or pivoting organization in some of the ways we've talked about already? Or can you provide a meal to workers and volunteers working in an emergency response organization? Or do you have someone who can provide masks for folks working in a pop-up remote food bank kind of situation, or something like that? And utilize the time that you have to evaluate both your program and revenue models in a really critical way. Can you realistically return to normal? Oh, there's one that I forgot to put as a bullet on here, which is utilize the time you have to, and this really applies to all three organizations. Make sure that someone, and for emergency response in particular, pivoting to a slightly lesser degree in wait and see organizations, it can be staff and or board. Make sure that you're personally connecting and phone calls with your key donors and supporters, and check in on them and make sure they know what you're doing, but also just check on how they're doing and make sure they're understanding what's happening with your organization. And you may or may not be in the right place to make an ask right now. And again, Dita's going to be hosting a webinar on fundraising in a crisis very soon. That's not really our expertise in this particular content moment, but making sure that you have very direct and very personal connections made over the phone with your key major donors and supporters. And I think I said earlier, if you have board members who can and will do that, that's fantastic. It's a really great use of board member connections and time and skill. And if they need a script, that's fine. Write them a script. Staff can write a script that board members can use to make them more comfortable in doing that. Dina, do we have some questions maybe we should stop, or shall we go on to this is where we shift into thinking beyond this immediate term, beyond the short-ish term as we're calling it? What do we think?
Well, so I've got a couple of questions, Jen. They're broad topics, so I'm not sure exactly where they land, but I'll go ahead and pose them, and then you decide if now's the right time. Brian's asking, some board members mistake holes in the boat during times of crisis for poor steering by the captain or the CEO. How do you help level set expectations and help board members realize what's an external versus what's an internal cause?
Wow, there's a tough question. I think it goes back a lot to communication, right? And keeping communication, and there's responsibility of the board chair in particular to be in communication with the executive director, understand where the executive director and staff are feeling pressure, and help evaluate what are internal versus external pressures, and to lead the board, to guide the board in supporting the executive director and staff as best they can, and in setting an example of providing the same compassion we've talked about staff extending to board in this time due to extraordinary circumstances that we all have professionally and personally. It's of course necessary for the board to be as compassionate and understanding as they possibly can of the pressures that the staff are working under as well.
I would add to that from the board perspective. It's really important. These are very complex situations facing organizations now, and board members need to be now more than ever asking good questions to make sure they have the right information to make these decisions. And, not just, I think, it's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame for where is it internal, is it external, is it some individual or, whatever, but to really understand the situation and be able to make decisions. And that's on all board members to be asking those questions so they have the right information, they understand the situation. But I agree with Jen, like the board chair really kind of taking the reins in saying, okay, yes, these are important things that we need to know versus this is getting more operational, this is, for the ED and the staff to decide. And that will help, those good strategic questions to understand the situation will help to see kind of what's going on. And, I think if this question is kind of coming more from the ED perspective and you're in that situation with your board, not asking those right questions or making assumptions that aren't correct, partnering with your board chair, and potentially other officers, your executive committee as well, to help with that communication back and help to kind of filter what's the right information that the board needs to understand the situation.
So I also have a question here about what guidelines could you recommend when reevaluating a budget in order to get that budget as lean as possible?
Well, you have to go through, what are your fixed costs? And, now the definition of fixed is becoming a little bit more fungible, in terms of rent, in terms of, other payments, looking at, what are, sometimes there are vendor payments that can be renegotiated, timeframes can be extended. I think just really going through to see, like to your point, getting the budget as lean as possible. You've got to just understand what has to be paid now, what can be extended, what can be negotiated, what's critical for service delivery versus, what could possibly be either put on hold temporarily or permanently. And it's really, I know from, doing this myself for organizations I've been on boards of and been staff of, it's really a line by line kind of invoice by invoice, looking at your expenses to understand that.
Shall we move on, Dina?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Great. Okay, so all of this has been what we're in a very articulate official technical way calling the short-ish term. So now we're going to think about the longer term. And, what we're calling long-term is a little bit of a moving target. We understand nobody knows right now precisely when stay-at-home orders and strict social distancing are going to completely go away. There are some signs, the governor may have said something in the last hour that I don't know about some restrictions being lifted. But I think we all, at this point, understand that this is going to be a slow evolution, gradual. We're not flipping a switch, certainly. And so we know that there are going to be ripple effects from this crisis, from the both health and economic impacts for some time to come. And so we recognize that as soon as we start to have a little bit more clarity about the time horizon here, your board should really start to think about what comes next in the intermediate to long-term future, in the next 6 months and beyond for your organization, let's say. We think that there are some crucial and difficult questions that fall into strategic priorities, what your organization is really about, and how you prioritize the core essence of your organization, about your programs, about your finances, and about your organizational structure. If strategic priorities are the why we exist, and what we're about, the organizational structure is kind of what's the framework, what's the scaffolding on which we're building the strategic priorities and accomplishing the strategic priorities. These are some pretty challenging conversations and dialogues to have, but we recognize that for many, if not most nonprofit organizations, they're going to need to happen. And we'd like to clarify that this is not a single board meeting and we're done kind of conversation. This is probably some ongoing, maybe it's weekly if we're still engaging virtually, as we may be for some time to come. This could be some 1-hour conversations over a period of 3 or 4 weeks. It could be a virtual retreat of 2 to 3 hours, or a couple of those on weekends or evenings, or whatever it might need to be, that works for your organization, that works for your board. And a lot of the work can also be done, some of this conversation and tough dialogue could be done by your executive committee, an ad hoc emergency planning committee, if you have a strategic planning committee, as long as it's transparent to the entire board that those conversations are happening, and then obviously you need to get full board buy-in for any choices that do get made that are about the nature and structure of the organization. So the strategic questions that we are suggesting as sort of a framework for you to start moving forward with these conversations, with this dialogue. Let's talk first about the strategic priorities. And the core, really the core of what we mean here is, in looking at your organizational vision, the change you seek to create in the world, the North Star that guides your organization's work, is it still relevant? Is it still, can you continue to seek to make that change as the world has changed around us? Is your vision still clear? Is it still relevant? If it is your mission statement still clear? Has it shifted? Does it need to shift? Is it still relevant? Do you have an existing strategic plan that you're operating under? This is something else that Suzanne referenced earlier about taking a look at that strategic plan. What remains as a high priority in your strategic plan? What adjustments need to be made to that strategic plan in terms of shifting priorities? And some things may simply need to fall off or be reframed in that strategic plan. To what degree do you think that changes you have made to your organization in terms of a program or delivery model or staffing or work from home or partnerships you have engaged in, will those be integrated into your organization going forward on a permanent basis? And what are the implications of all of this on your programs, your operations, and your core business model? Which leads us directly to programs and thinking about the way that your programs are structured. This is a time to really take stock and think about the programs we had existing prior to March of this year, so long ago. Can we return to doing, can we maintain and or can we return to doing everything we were doing up until that point, up until social distancing and the pandemic impacts began? Should we return to doing everything we were doing up until that point? Is it appropriate? Are all of those programs really the highest and best use of our financial and human resources? Are there new needs that we have discovered as a result that we think will continue in some way? Are there new needs that we should be addressing that perhaps we weren't before, but that we have in an emergency way now? Do we need to continue to do that in a different way? Are all of the programs that we have had in our portfolio up to this point, are they all sufficiently really closely aligned with and consistent with our mission? Are they all something that is a crucial need in our community and an unduplicated need that if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it. Are they financially sustainable, especially in an environment where revenue has changed and finances may have changed, which we'll talk about in just a moment? And is it something that we really know how to do and have the capacity to do? Asking those questions may help you to make some discoveries about, there are really some things we have been doing for a long time, but aren't appropriate to our mission in this moment and going forward, or that really somebody else is doing it better. Well, maybe we want to partner with them instead, or those kinds of considerations. So let's talk a little bit about finances. This was one of the key points that Suzanne mentioned in the first half as well. Really getting an extremely clear picture and understanding of the revenue model that you were operating under up until March of this year, and what has happened since that point. How has the revenue proportions from major donors, from foundations, from contracts, how have those things shifted in the last couple of months? And do you think those changes are likely to remain? Is this going to be the new normal, at the risk of using the overused phrase? What other changes do you think might be coming over the next 6 months to a year? May things shift back a little bit in the direction of prior to March, but maybe not all the way? What else do you think might be happening with your revenue that you can tell from your donors, from your foundation supporters? What are the realistic prospects for returning to normal or restructuring the model? And here again, I think the best case, worst case, and middle case scenario might be useful to not just try to project with a crystal ball, but test out some possible different ways of anticipating what different if-then scenarios mean. And finally, organizational structure. Taking a question, are there needs for your organization to think about changing the shape and the way it is aligned and structured to achieve the mission that you seek to achieve? Are there opportunities for some strategic realignment, strategic restructuring that makes sense moving forward? Are there opportunities for ongoing collaboration with other organizations where there's some synergy in the populations and communities that you serve, or there's some synergy in the kinds of programs that you offer? Are there opportunities for realigning programs? As I said on the program slide, are there things that you've been doing, but perhaps someone else has more capacity or expertise or serves the geography or the particular community in a different way that you could actually make an agreement to hand off a particular program to a different organization? Or is it perhaps time to explore the possibility of merging with organizations of like mind and like vision and mission in order to advance those missions and visions with some more greater economies of scale and greater impact? So these are the kinds of bigger picture, taking a step back, thinking really critically and really thoughtfully about your organization moving forward into something of a new world that we are suggesting and recommending that conversations need to be starting to happen around the board table in the coming month or so. And Dina, I will toss it back to you. I suspect, looks like we may have some questions at this point.
Yes. So I'm going to just go ahead and start at the top here. It's going to take us back a little bit, but thoughts and suggestions. What guidelines could you recommend when I already did that one. I did ask that one, right? We did the lean as possible. Okay. So I have a comment here from Sarah, and I think it's a really important one because I think it's not just tactical, but also about introducing the culture of learning. And that is, let's see here. The board members are less available than they were before, and we are pivoting by creating hybrid teams of staff and board and stakeholders to help with time-sensitive decisions and pivot activities. I branded these hybrid groups TNTs. They're Transformer Nonprofit Ninja Teams. That naming has been very helpful to demonstrate that we're in a learning and growing space. So I know, Suzanne, you wanted to respond to that.
I love that idea. I love the name. We mentioned earlier having smaller working groups, but Transformer Nonprofit Ninja Team is like, that's a way better name than small working group. But yeah, the essence is there's some board members who are going to have more time, some who are going to have less. You're going to have to work with what you have, knowing that still all board members need to be engaged for their overall responsibilities, but kind of day-to-day involvement is going to be a little bit different. And I just love that idea of them being hybrid teams where it's staff and board holding hands, going through this together, and certainly involving other stakeholders where it makes sense. I mean, that's brilliant. And focusing in on those like really critical topics and questions, fantastic idea.
Mm-hmm. So I think we started down this path, and this is from Anne. When making cuts, I feel it's very important to identify agreed upon goals that are trying to be achieved and the ongoing priorities to be maintained within these cuts. Could you give examples of different lenses that you would look through in making cuts to budgets as a board member for a nonprofit organization?
So, I mean, I think the different lenses really do. I mean, it comes down to, and I answered kind of the earlier question about, you know, how do you get your budget as lean as possible, and kind of that tactical, like line by line, looking through it, what needs to be paid and what doesn't need to be paid. That's basic cash management. Financial scenarios, financial planning is a little more strategic, you know, and I do think, you know, if your organization has a strategic plan, you absolutely need to go back to that strategic plan. And, you know, I know we don't necessarily have the time to do a full strategic plan review right now. I'm not saying that, but look at what we're supposed to be your strategic priorities for right now, for the coming year. What remains as a strategic priority? What can be put to the side? And then what are maybe some new strategic priorities? Maybe it's that, like, you know, webinar series you're delivering now, or, you know, some other direct response that is elevated to be a strategic priority. And then you look at the resources you need to execute. And there needs to be probably a little bit of going back and forth to say, all right, we really would like these to be our priorities, but we think realistically these are the resources we have, and adjusting. And, you know, I think it is really important to think near term. You know, I think for many nonprofits, the reality of the operating reserves that we do or don't have is we got to focus on the near term to survive, for sure, but not, you know, be completely, you know, short-sighted in thinking about where we're headed strategically longer term. And, you know, one thing that Jennifer mentioned kind of in her last remarks was around, you know, the really tough questions of, are we still viable longer term? And when we look at our strategic priorities, if we're just feeling like we just don't have the resources, even in slimmed down strategic priorities, to continue, what does that mean for our organization? You know, is a merger a possibility? Is some refining of our mission where we need to go? I mean, that's where it definitely gets very challenging. And we know that, but that's where board has to help navigate these waters.
So I have another question now, slight shift in topic, many nonprofits rely on fundraising events to maintain their operations. As we're forced to move from the typical in-person events towards remote events, is there any data that might help guide our planning regarding what percentage of fundraising we can expect as compared to what we would normally raise during more traditional in-person fundraisers? Wow, that's like the $65 million question.
Absolutely. I nominate Suzanne.
The answer to that question. I don't know that we have data yet on it, because I think the reality is this whole world of like virtual fundraisers, even though some organizations maybe attempted to do it in the past, nobody was really doing virtual fundraisers in a big way, and certainly not as a like replacement for an in-person event. So I think time will tell in terms of like really how well do these work. Like most fundraising, it depends on relationships, it depends on who your audience is. We're seeing many of our clients move towards virtual events. We actually, we can even include a link. We did a development webinar last week and had a big section on virtual events and some great tips from an event planner who is doing a lot of these now, and things she's like seeing very quickly in terms of what's working and what's not working. In terms of anticipating how much revenue, if you're going to move to a virtual event, how much, I mean, I think you do need to just realistically discount it a bit, especially if you don't have, if it's an event that was planned for the fall, so you didn't necessarily have a lot of sponsorships or ticket sales already locked in now. I think you got to discount some of that revenue. You know, if it was an event that's like a May event and you already had some sponsors and ticket sales and things locked in, you might see less of a discount, and you might even be close to your goal. We've seen that with some of our clients. But thinking about maybe how you can shift to more of a major donor engagement with some who previously would support your event, either aren't going to come on for a virtual event or there's something else going on. Thinking about online auctions and experiences that make sense in this day in life we're all living in, things like that. But I think there were some really good tips in our webinar last week on virtual events, so we'll make sure we include that link for some details.
If I could also just, add to that, this is just a good reminder to all of us that this is an opportunity to bring our donors in closer. And that includes our event sponsors and corporate partners, where extending an invitation to weigh in on what's working for them as our philanthropic partners and what's not, maybe even getting a sense of whether or not a remote event accomplishes some of their business and outreach and marketing goals in the same way that a face-to-face event would I think is really important. And it gives us an opportunity to check in with our donors. So really, really important at this time. So I have another question. I'm an ED of a small nonprofit. I have 5 hourly staff members, and their hours have been curtailed because work has slowed. I'm the only full-time salaried employee. I'm driving a lot of the budget conversations. How do we have a conversation about my compensation?
So that's that conversation you can't and don't really need to lead. I would suggest as a first step to have a one-on-one conversation with your board chair, or if you have a finance chair, and explain where you are, make sure they have a really clear picture and understanding of the current financial situation, and then ask them to take the lead. Encourage them to take the lead on having a conversation among the board about your compensation. Suzanne, would you add anything to that?
Yes, I think having been in those shoes before in an organization and looking at my own salary and considering cutting it for the good of the organization overall, and now as a consultant looking at organizations making tough decisions, I think one thing we need to keep in mind is, remember that nonprofit starvation cycle that we've talked about for the past few years, nonprofits, trying to squeeze their overhead and in response to funders and just trying to like do more with less. I think we do need to be cautious during times of crisis of squeezing even more, including salaries, to the point that we can't continue operating and it's not sustainable, or putting, lowering salaries in the interest of the mission. And I know it is coming from a wonderfully good place, and then you're not sustainable in a few years, or you've cut salaries to the point where it's not a living wage. So I think there's some caution in terms of cutting salary, especially for employees whose hours are still, what they used to be, expectations are still what they were before. I think for hourly workers, when they're working, fewer hours and being paid then for fewer hours, slightly different situation, as you kind of mentioned in your question. So, obviously this is a close conversation with the board, but I would just urge some caution in kind of the knee-jerk reaction of cutting salaries overall in the interest of the budget, and thinking, if you do feel like you need to do it, build in, with the board, a time when you're going to revisit it. So whether it's 3 months from now, or not too far, not a year from now, to revisit that to see, okay, are things stabilized a bit? Can we go back to where salaries were before we're out of crisis? And if you're not able to at that point, then I think it's looking at, okay, are there more strategic decisions we need to make about programs, about other expenses, or how we're operating? So that's just my one kind of word of caution there.
So this is I think a very positive perspective question that I'd really like to sink my teeth into as we go towards normal, which yay for normal. But we're still worrying about social distancing. Any thoughts about how to return to in-person meetings or staying with Zoom?
Well, I feel like most of us who do this kind of work are creatures who crave human interaction. Human interaction builds esprit de corps and unity of purpose among a board, and it's important. And so when it is safe and when we can, I think there's high desirability of going back to in-person meetings. But my concern is most boards, I suspect, and I'm not a public health official, I don't know. I think it may still be a while before that is really feasible, because even as we start to ease, I think we're still going to have restrictions on gatherings of people, maybe more than 10. I don't know. I don't have any inside knowledge. So I think once we can go back to direct in-person meetings, we want to do that. But I think it's still going to be a while before that is really practical for us.
Yeah, and I think we also need to embrace, I think this is work as well as, as well as board meetings and kind of sort of life in general, but there's going to be a hybrid. And I think, as boards, we need to think about what would it look like if we have, some board members who are able to be in the room together, some who, for different circumstances are still needing to be at home and participate by Zoom or other ways. And how can, I think that's an even more challenging facilitation and decision-making scenario where you have some people face-to-face and some people remote. So I think it's just being aware that if and when we get to that more hybrid situation, also true with employees, it's going to take another round of really serious thinking about how to make it work and adjusting and, making communications as clear as we can and information in advance and listening to each other and all that good stuff.
And I would just, thank you, Suzanne. I would just add to that in particular, and I think this applies to Zoom meetings as well, but those hybrid meetings, as you very correctly point out, are even more challenging in that I think it is wise to have some ground rules in terms of how the folks who are virtual are integrated into the conversation and sort of order of speaking, and making sure there's somebody who is keyed into being the bridge between the folks that are live and in person, and keeping an eye on the folks that are participating virtually to make sure that there really is a flow and a connectedness to the conversation, especially around these important conversations that need to be happening.
So I have a question that could not be better for this particular consulting firm. If this is a year that we are scheduled to prepare our strategic plan, should we postpone that process until there are fewer unknowns and continue in the meanwhile to operate under our COVID response plan?
It's a really good question. We actually have, Jen and I are working together on a number of strategic plans right now. And in the past few weeks actually kicked off a couple of strategic planning processes. In general, I think that if you still have the board involvement, including a strategic planning committee that is able to meet and discuss, I think it's still advisable to continue on, but I do think the process will look a bit different because we don't have blinders on to what's currently happening and only think about, oh, 3 years from now when everything's back to normal, what will it look like? I mean, you really need to focus on where you are now. I think the process of strategic planning can really help with a lot of the strategic questions that will help kind of in the near term as well as the longer term. So I think the process itself, and our clients have seen this already, is really helpful given where things are right now. It jumpstarts these strategic conversations. But I do think there will be some changes. So things like, I've seen a couple of organizations shorten the time frame of the strategic plan we're putting together. So thinking about maybe a 2-year plan versus a 3 to 5 year plan. And also like doing even more scenario planning in terms of the financials to think about, what the world might look like, what programs might look like, what financials might look like, and more so than we would a few months ago. So I think it still has merit, but you don't want to go into it if you have a board that is very much just kind of the basics. Let's keep the organization going. We don't have the time now to be part of that strategic planning committee. At that point, you might want to delay at least by a few months kicking that off.
And the final question, I think, is both a comment and a question. Would knowing how individuals and families coped during a shutdown offer clues to how services might be offered differently in the future? So what all are we learning to inform our strategy and strategic direction during this time that will be really useful for those planning processes going forward?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes, it would be helpful. And I suspect there's going to be a lot written in the coming weeks, as already has been. But I think that is one of those situations that actually circles back to one of the recommendations we made for organizations that are pivoting and still having direct contact with clients, with communities. Perhaps that's built into, if you're going to be able to do a little bit of evaluation about how well your new program design or delivery is working, maybe there's a way to incorporate a question or two that gets some sense of how that community that you serve is doing and is coping. And that can be shared through a wonderful resource like the Center for Nonprofit Leadership or the Nonprofit Resource Network to help inform other nonprofits and partners in your community.
Suzanne, any final comments from you? Anything to add?
No, I think that was a good kind of last question for us.
Well,
I think the last comment is really just a thanks, to board and staff and all that you're doing for your incredible organizations. As Dina said when we started, these are truly unprecedented times, and we appreciate all that you do and appreciate you being part of this webinar and being part of our kind of community of practicing together and supporting each other.
Well, in closing, Suzanne, Jennifer, thank you, and Rosie, thank you so much for not only being phenomenal colleagues and partners, but also dear friends. I know this has been a really heavy row to keep the boat metaphor going for everyone. And I really appreciate everyone on the call for spending some time with us today. I hope you'll let us know if there are some questions that are left outstanding, future topics of interest and need. There were a few questions that exceeded the scope of this particular webinar, and I included my email address in response to some of those. If you wouldn't mind, please just following up with me via email. We'll get you the answers to those questions via email. So without going too much over our time together, I'll just express our deepest sense of gratitude to the nonprofit sector. I hope each of you stay well and that you take good care of your friends, your family, and your colleagues. Suzanne, Rosie, Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us.